Research is critically important in terms of homelessness for a number of factors. Getting a basic statistical profile of homelessness is actually surprisingly difficult. Think in a country like Canada where we have all sorts of numbers that are available to us. You can pick up the daily newspaper, you can log on to the internet, for instance, and find any second of any day the stock market, thousands or more stocks, whether they're going up or down, infinitesimal changes in the value of the dollar and so on. But yet, as a country and as a province and as a city, we don't have a reliable indicator, for instance, of the number of people who experience homelessness. We have certain measures that help us to approximate that, number of people sleeping in shelters, for instance, those sorts of things, but we don't have any of those reliable indicators. So one of the most fundamental purposes of research is to, first of all, from a statistical level, to give us some sense of what are the realities in terms of the numbers out there. Why is it important to have numbers? Because, first of all, numbers allow us to set targets, realistic targets. If there's 1,000 homeless people in Toronto, you set a certain target. If there's 10,000 homeless people or 100,000 homeless people, you set other targets. So we really need to have good statistics in order to set targets. But statistics and research are important as well in terms of assessing and evaluating initiatives that are put in place. Quite frankly, we don't have any real measures to say whether all of the things that are being done in terms of homelessness are actually making a difference. Are they reducing homelessness? Well, we don't know because we don't actually have any good numbers statistically on homelessness overall. So one of the first and most important values of good research is that it helps us, first of all, to set targets, and then it helps us to monitor for accountability for success in terms of initiatives we do. Research also helps us to understand the complexities of in a very important issue like homelessness. In its most simple form, homelessness is just simply, as the name suggests, it's somebody who lives without a house. But there's a whole complex series of issues that begin to emerge in terms of pathways into homelessness, routes out of homelessness, the complex interactions between homelessness, health, income, employment, et cetera, education, all sorts of other factors. And good research also helps to understand some of the complexities so we can actually be sure that solutions that we're putting in place address the real complexities. Sometimes social policy is developed based on hunches, instincts, whims, intuition, and there's nothing wrong with many people who have been very involved in homelessness issues over the years have good instincts. They know what works because they've got a good long time experience, but we think social policy ultimately also has to be based on something more than just whims and instincts, and so good research helps us to unravel some of the complexity and to understand what are some of the real factors that contribute to both the increase in homelessness that we've seen in most urban areas in Canada in the last 2 decades, and also helps us to understand what are the solutions that will actually make a practical difference. One of the most important things we need to do is we need to have a big table that includes everybody. We think that ultimately the solution will come when the partnership is robust, when it's broad and it includes not just simply federal, provincial, municipal governments, although they've got to be at the table because they play a significant role. Municipal governments control land use, zoning issues, building standards issues, very important player at the table. Provincial governments often deal with health issues, with supports, and with housing concerns, and of course the federal government has that historic role in housing programs, repair, and so on. So it's important that all levels of government are meaningfully involved at the table. We also need to have Aboriginal organizations at the table. One of the dirty little secrets about homelessness and housing insecurity in Canada is that Aboriginal people, who make up just a tiny fraction of the population, bear a disproportionate burden of homelessness and housing insecurity. So we need to have Aboriginal organizations at the table. What we don't want to do is replicate some of the patronizing practices of the past where non-Aboriginal people will say, we know what's best for Aboriginal people, we'll build the housing, we'll manage it, we'll do a better job than you can. So we need to have Aboriginal organizations at the table. We need to have community-based organizations at the table. Some of the greatest housing successes in Canada over the last 4 or 5 decades have been successes that have been undertaken by church organizations, by community service clubs, by other faith groups, by various nonprofit and community organizations, by cooperative organizations, a whole wide variety of groups in the nonprofit, the community sector, who have direct experience, who have decades of history. They need to be at the table as experts as well. We also need to have the private sector at the table. There used to be this notion that somehow affordable housing was different, that had nothing to do with the private market for housing, but in fact, even in the heyday of Canada's national housing programs in the 1970s and 1980s, when 10, 20, 30,000 units were being developed every year across the country, it was private developers who were often taking on the contract to actually develop the housing. Architects were doing the planning. The contracts were going to private construction companies and so on. So the private sector has always been deeply involved in affordable housing, needs to absolutely be at the table. They have an expertise that needs to be there. And of course, another group that needs to be at the table, and I don't mention them last, because they're least important. It's people who have a direct experience of housing and homelessness. They need to absolutely be at the table. Back from 1990 to 1993, when I was managing a housing redevelopment project in Toronto called the Rupert Pilot Project, it was to develop 525 units of affordable housing for homeless people who had mental health, drug use, or alcohol use issues in their lives. One of the things that we insisted on was that the people who were going to be the residents of the housing had to be directly involved in the architectural work and designing the housing, and had to be involved in development and the operation of the housing. At the time, for some of the people who were initially involved in the project, they found it a bit odd to think, what could these people possibly bring to the table? Because after all, they're the victims of homelessness. And there's sometimes a notion that somehow people have brought it on themselves. It's their individual pathology or their lifestyle choice, so they shouldn't and couldn't be part of the overall solution. In fact, people bring an extremely valuable set of expertise who have direct experience of this. So ultimately, we think that the partnerships at the national level, at the provincial level, have to include all of that variety. And this is, when we began talking about this a few years ago, it was considered a bit unusual, but increasingly now governments are recognizing that in fact you have to create that kind of multi-sectoral partnership in order to have effective change, in order to make progress. So just for instance, in mid-February, the government of New Brunswick, in setting up their new plan to reduce and ultimately eliminate poverty in that province, has created a new corporation which will oversee the reduction of poverty in that province. And the corporation has a 22-person board of directors, and they're drawn from exactly those sectors I mentioned. They're drawn from governments, from the private sector, from the community sector, and from people who have a direct experience of poverty. So I think enlightened governments are recognizing that we need to have this big table approach. We need to bring everyone together, harness their energy, work in a coordinated fashion, and ultimately that's how we're going to translate the research and policy that we know is out there, that tells us what we need to do, how we can translate that into action.